Greetings. My name is Jonathan Sarna. I'm the director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies, and it's really my great pleasure to welcome you to today's Schusterman seminar, which is taking place entirely on Zoom. Dr. Shana Weiss, who we welcome back, will be moderating the chat. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat, which you can find at the bottom of your screen. Our speaker today is Dr. Noah Hysler Rubin. She's a town planner, a historical geographer working on the history of modern planning in the land of Israel. She combines historical archival research with critical cultural perspectives and shows how political climates and social practices and cultural trends are reflected in planning conventions and how they shape contemporary landscapes in Israel. Some will know her work on Patrick Geddes, but today we're very fortunate that she's going to be talking with us about the Jerusalem Archives Project, which she heads. She is, in addition, a professor at the Architecture and Urban Design at the famous Bezalel Academy of Arts and Design, and she is the expert on digitizing Jerusalem's modern architectural and planning collections. So join me in welcoming from Jerusalem, Noah Hysler Rubin. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Sana. Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's a great pleasure for me to join you. So yes, after this lovely introduction and great hosting, I will tell you a little bit about my work. And as I will show you, I'm not the only one doing digitization of archives, not even in Jerusalem, but our project is certainly in a good place doing important work. So let me tell you a little bit about it. So I am actually a scholar of British town planning in Israel, and I concentrate on Jerusalem and not only. The story I tell about Jerusalem and other cities in Israel is the story of modernization, which is usually connected to the coming of the British, as they brought with them the modern practice of town planning and advanced notions of sanitation, hygiene, and urban amenities. I therefore wrote extensively about the planning of Jerusalem since the Mandate period, and also about urban heritage, which is a derivative of planning, and the identification of the old city as an urban emblem by the British, which should be preserved. Recently, however, through a practical research project which I'm conducting and which I will tell you about, I learned of the need to expand and enhance the story. I will start with a short illustration, then I will describe the theoretical background to my work, and finally, I will tell you about the Jerusalem Architectural Archives Project and its practical and theoretical potential for ingenuity. So let me share with you my slides. And I will start with a quote. The 50 previous years of unchecked religious exploitation had already hidden or thrown out of scale most of the ancient northern and western walls by the building hard against them of colossal and hideous convents and monasteries. A discerning conqueror in 1850 could have established the shops, convents, and hotels well away from the old city and have left the gray ramparts in a setting of green olives and cypresses. This is, of course, from Ronald Storr's memoirs written in the early 1920s. And his final quote, which I chose, I found a positive pleasure in replying to a request for a concession to run trams to Bethlehem and the Mount of Olives, that the first rail section would be laid over the dead body of the military governor. So Arnold Stolz was interested in uncovering or recreating the biblical landscape of Jerusalem alongside its modern planning and advancement. The three planners he appointed between 1918 to 1927, William McLean, Charles Robert Ashby, and Patrick Geddes, aided him in setting the guidelines for protecting the old city and encircling it, as Stolz wrote himself, in a setting of green, olives, and cypresses, detaching the new from the old and restoring the city walls to its Ottoman glories. And here are just a few illustrations of how he chose to do it. This is one of the first modern plans for the city made by McLean. It's very different from the ones that followed it, but you can certainly see the way that the old city is put in the middle of the plan, which is of course not the way that the real geography is. It's not the reality of Jerusalem, but you can certainly see that nothing is to be done in the old city, which is called by then the Holy City. The rest of the planning, the rest of the development, everything that happens and advances in the city takes place outside the walls, to the west, and not only outside the walls, but also detached from them. So you can see that there are three different planning areas: the old city where nothing is supposed to take place, everything to its west where the modern city is to advance, and everything to its east where nothing should take place at all. And if you look carefully, you can see another line encircling the old city. That is a place that nothing should happen in. And of course, there is Ashby's plan of the walls themselves, the promenade. What actually Stolz had in mind, and Ashby helped him in recreate, or at least to plan, is to restore, to rehabilitate the old city walls, and actually create the promenade, which we all enjoy very much today, and even those encircled in nice gardens. This is a nice plan. Not everything took place, but it gives us a very, very good idea of the way the British wanted to preserve the city and definitely keep it intact, keep the old city within the walls. It was only when I took a step back and started studying the forces which shaped the city prior to the coming of the British that I learned about the modern, there's no other way to describe it, Ottoman endeavors to replenish the city, to modernize it, to enhance it. And of course, there is the tram that we mentioned before, which were planned from the beginning of the 20th century to run from Bab el Khalil, Jaffa Gate, to Bethlehem and Hebron. And I learned for the first time about the actual effect Stolz and his decisions had on halting early projects of modernization of the city. And here's one more picture of how the British imagined the old city, how they portrayed it. So you can see on top, there is a photograph of the reality of the old city and its surroundings. And at the bottom, we have a picture which is actually very modern and it's forward looking, although it looks ancient. And this is the way that they wanted to keep the old city within the walls, all kept intact, and the new city around it. But then we found a very interesting paper in the Ottoman archives of the Prime Minister's office, which is stored in Istanbul, and I will read it. Since residents, it's addressed to the merciful and faithful Highness, the Ottoman Sultan. It was written by the Great Wazir, the most senior minister in Ottoman government in Jerusalem, and it was written almost 30 years before Stolz's text. Since residents that live within the citadel of Al-Quds al-Sharif and its western side have to walk around it too much in order to enter the town from Al-Khalil Gate, Al-Khalil, opening a new gate in the north side of the wall is suggested, and building a police office. In accordance with cost estimation, it will cost about 600 gold. Also regarding to be able to make of all these things, this is not our translation, but you get the idea, for necessary straightening and enlargement will happen with the abandonment of landlords via granting. So this is the request, and here is the reply. And you can see that the new gate was opened in the wall, inscribing an insignia on the new gate, Bab al-Jadid, and details the decree is our Sultan's. So the full story is that the need to build a police station and open a new gate in the northern side rose in order to accommodate the needs of the residents arriving from the north having to make a detour around the wall in order to enter from Jaffa Gate. Despite the high cost of cultivating the land and compensating the adjacent landowners, the request was approved, and a new gate with the Tagra, the Sultan's seal by Abdul Hamid, at its top was constructed on the northern side of the wall near the Christian quarter. This enterprise not only reflects the Ottomans' willingness to act for the well-being of all its residents, but also to reinforcing the connections between the empire residents in Europe. As one of the main reasons to open a new gate in the wall was in order to allow the people to exit and use the new facilities built by foreign empires outside the walls, especially the French in this case. But it also gives us a very, very good idea of how the Ottomans actually tended to the needs of the public and tended to their needs and their request to improve and to modernize and to progress the city and their use of it. A year later, another breach was made in the wall with the opening of Jaffa Gate upon the visit of Kaiser Wilhelm to Jerusalem in 1898. And this is another lovely plan we found in the same archive. It was an important act of connecting the old city to the new one, improving access all around, followed by the modern clock tower, which was built a few years later in 1907. So this for me as a planner is a treasure. It's a beautiful plan of how Jaffa Gate and its surroundings were adapted. Once again, the official reason was in order to allow the Kaiser, the German Kaiser, to enter the city on his horse. Actually, he came with his carriage, so a widening of the road had to take place. But it's one step forward towards the modernization of the city and for connecting the old city and the new, which is of course completely different from what we saw that the British wished for. So when the British arrived and instated a policy of restoring the walls and protecting them as part of the designation of the entity, which is the old holy city, they were faced with these deeds, which were meant to advance the city, leave behind the traditional past of the enclosure behind closed walls, listen to the needs of the inhabitants and supply their needs, modernize it. Yet in their own quest of modernizing the city on one hand and preserving it on the other, they were devastated. The British eventually took down the clock tower, but the openings in the walls remained in spite of their pronounced reservations. The small story of separating or connecting old and new Jerusalem, keeping the walls intact, rehabilitating them, or opening breaches in them, maybe slowly taking them down, is not unique in the historiography of Israel-Palestine, its modern planning and its heritage. In fact, until recently, when speaking of modernization and development in Jerusalem or Israel, the Ottoman period and the British Mandate era were traditionally studied separately as distinct periods in the evolution of Jerusalem and its inhabitants, described almost as separate snapshots. We had 400 years of Ottoman rules, this is what happened. Then we had 30 years of Mandate rule, this is what happened. Then of course came the state of Israel and a completely new story began. But did it really? British planning in Palestine is considered an act of foreign modernization, an introduction of an advanced practice and discourse, an imported innovation, and a complete transformation of the backwards traditional landscape of Ottoman MENA. Once again, we had 400 years of Ottoman rule, then the British arrived, and something completely different started. This is the way that we tell our history, our urban history. The study of modern planning in Palestine is also closely associated with the coming of the British, and more specifically with the British Mandate. Through the prism of modern town planning, the break from the Ottoman to the British and the changing of political regime was considered a key factor in the modernization of the region and the only way forward. Research regarding the modernization of Jerusalem and Palestine as a whole from the urban planning perspective makes a clear distinction between the coming of the British and actually also Zionism, an apparent Western alliance, and everything that preceded it. In general, Israeli urban research describes modern urban planning as a joint British Zionist endeavor. It dwells on the addition of modern Jewish neighborhoods in the shape of garden suburbs and the maturation of 19th century colonies and suburbs into cities after 1948. Thus, Israeli urban research typically presents a progressive narrative representing both the Zionist discourse of modernization and Jewish rebirth in an ancient homeland. The exploration of the history of Israeli cities generally relies on selective documentation recovering a very specific type of urban heritage and losing centuries of non-Jewish history in the process. Lately, however, and this is where a new story begins, the imagined borders between the late Ottoman era and the British era which followed it are being dismantled as researchers draw careful connections between them on various planes, shattering overstated dichotomies, connecting people in time and space, highlighting similarities rather than differences, and recognizing continuities. The story of Jerusalem Architectural Archives is one of these endeavors. So let me tell you a little bit about our archives. Jerusalem Archives Project, or in its full name, the Digitization of Jerusalem Architectural Archives, is an extensive project of heritage documentation and digitization, which aims to locate, expose, and digitize official and personal documentation pertaining to the city's modern building and planning. The project is researched in Bezalel, Academy of Arts and Design, Jerusalem, in collaboration with the National Library and funded by the Jerusalem Development Authority. The main objective of the project is to provide access to historic collections of Jerusalem planning and architecture, and to establish a database that will bring together the diverse materials dealing with the planning and design of Jerusalem. The project also has a direct practical aim of improving sustainable development and conservation practice, and for enhancing heritage research, providing an important component of knowledge in the modern spatial history of Jerusalem. It thus deals with handling urban plans, architectural plans, maps, photographs, and documents. And the few documents that I have exposed to you already are all part of the project. Some of them were known to us before, some of them were exposed in this work. So basically, the main project, the main aim was very practical, to allow planners and those dealing with conservation to be literally more knowledgeable about the work. I will talk a little bit about the actual work of conservation and urban heritage and its preservation, but the basic idea is to provide practitioners with documentation. Eventually, what they have to do if they want to preserve a plan or a building, they have to go to the municipality, to go to the preservation committee, and proclaim and provide them with proof that the building or the site are worth presentation, are worth preservation. And the way to do it is very simply by documentation. So the very basic idea of our project was to provide documentation, to allow better research, to allow better access to archives which are not always very known or very accessible, and I will talk about that a little bit later. Another purpose of the project is to join in the effort of uncovering hidden and inaccessible archives. It thus exposes records which are locked behind paywalls, complex ethno-national and municipal bureaucracies, or simply unclassified, fragile, and inaccessible. And we had a chat prior to our talk here about the inaccessibility of a very important archive, being the historical archives of Jerusalem municipality, holding wonderful treasures, especially to archive mice like me, but they're very inaccessible. So we wanted to help people know what's in the archive and access it more easily. So the aims of the eventual website that we're building are compatible with other initiatives which strive to harmonize between archives regarding accessibility, digitization, shared information, creating common search tools, and mutual support in all professional aspects. And as I mentioned before, we're not the first project to do it. We're definitely not the only one. And I will just mention briefly a few of them. One of the very important projects which is doing similar work is called Opening Jerusalem Archives. You can see there is a motive here, which talks about history from the bottom up. Oh, I'm sorry. History from the bottom up. History must be a bottom up, which until now has been the farthest thing from the minds of Jerusalem historians, often obsessed by ideological and geostrategic issues alone. So the aim of this archive is actually to allow access to archives of Jerusalem, allowing people to tell their own stories, not having to deal with official historiography of the city, but simply being able to read the records for their own and make their own story. And of course, the records are varied and made by different authors, which is another issue when you deal with the archive. Another interesting project, two interesting projects, in fact, are those of the National Library. And if you're familiar with the subject, you might recognize some of the older maps of Jerusalem, which are kept in the National Library. And I think this is actually the very first project of digitization of maps and plans. I'm not sure if it's in Israel. In Jerusalem, definitely. There is a collection of a few thousand of maps of Jerusalem, which were kept for years in the National Library, and they're all now available for, they're all accessible through through their library website. And if you look at them, you can magnify them, you can enlarge them again and again, and you can see minute details of the city. And the closer you get to the present, the more you can get an idea of what the city really looked like for many, many years. And another project of the National Library, and I'm sorry for the Hebrew, it is the National Digital Collection of Architecture, Dance, Design, and Theater. And it's also a project that was initiated in Bezalel in collaboration with the National Library. And it actually digitizes and catalogs collections of architects and dancers and designers and theater people of Jerusalem, of Israel, at least of the 20th century. And it's a beautiful collection. It's a beautiful treasure of personal and official archives of people who actually made the culture of Israel. And I'm sure you can already imagine the connections between these different databases, which eventually all tell the story of Israel, Jerusalem, its space, and its becoming, its design. But let's get back to the Jerusalem archives. The target years of our project were designated from the 1860s, when the Ottoman municipality was first established. So you can see the motive here of modernization. And until the 1960s, just before Jerusalem grew beyond recognition, or in other words, when the last British plan was still relevant. Back in 2012, when the project was first initiated, we recognized, and I quote our own proposal, the early modern period, especially in the mid-19th century onwards, saw changes in the development of Jerusalem, and as a result, its planning and design towards the end of the Ottoman period in Jerusalem, building extended beyond the walls and changed beyond recognition. Yet, being based on research known to us then, the description of the project goals were clearly mandate-oriented, and I quote again, during British rule, Jerusalem was under a colonial regime of the Commonwealth, and where innovation and governance practices, including urban planning and design, were observed as in other cities and diverse places, which were then part of the British Empire. Thus, Jerusalem during the British rule was a touchstone for other parts of the world. But this is all wonderful, and I still stand behind it, but what we did later on is widen our scope. The collections of the project were chosen accordingly. We targeted national, municipal, and private collections, turning to, amongst others, the Central Zionist Archives, which hold the larger part of Bezalel archives, YMCA, whose historic collections include plans of the site and its renovation over the years. We also viewed documentation. Oh, I'll show you some illustrations in a minute. We also viewed the documentation archive of Shomrei HaChomot, Haredi Kollel, which established Mea She'arim, as well as the historic collection of Knesiat Immanuel, which holds boxes of photographs of Jerusalem from the 1850s onwards and documentation of the work of the architect Konrad Schick in the city. We coordinated our work with the National Library, and more specifically with their own work on the National Visual Culture Collections and the Israel Antiquities Authority. So we had lots of ideas and we wanted to go to many places. Eventually, we turned our attention to 6 specific collections, which I will describe shortly. But let me just touch for just a few sentences on the complex work, on the actual work in archives, the actual complexity of uncovering archives in plural, because we're talking about 6 different archives whose rationale is completely different. Archives which were compiled by completely different people in different time periods with completely different agendas. Of course, technically they're completely different, but also their agendas are different. So let me talk just a little bit about that. Our work raises many concerns regarding present-day archives and their accessibility and the condition of the materials and their maintenance, as well as more critical questions regarding the authority of archives, their systems of classification, and the advantages and disadvantages of digitization. So keywords here are classification and digitization. These are not technical procedures. They actually raise a lot of questions. Transforming the documents into digital data should be understood as a process of heritage in the making that can open opportunities for active participation in and contestation over the very meaning and purpose of heritage. Heritage for whom? By who? Who benefits from these identifications? Who's rendered invisible or lost? This work inevitably explores possible design logics of a transnational data infrastructure that would incorporate contested and contradicting epistemologies of urban heritage. If we define someone's heritage as important, we obviously overlook someone else's heritage, or we think it's not that important. How do we define that? Which documents do we choose in order to back our claims? This work helps us to examine how the co-production of metadata can play a role in engaging the complexity and historicity of data, and finally assess whether digitization processes can open up the fora and spaces for co-production of socially contextualized information that advances truth and accountability without the need for consensus. So I'm hinting here at different narratives. There are different ways of reading the building of the city and its eventual heritage. And the more documentation we can find and make accessible, and the more archives that we can expose, we allow more and more threads of different stories. So then we have to decide which story is more important, or maybe we don't have to decide. Maybe we can let all these stories coexist, but first we have to understand what we're dealing with. So we ended up working with 6 archival collections, which were chosen for both essential and practical reasons. Anyway, after retrieving the collections, cataloging them scientifically, and examining them closely, it soon became apparent that a different historical approach is needed. And the very first collection, which I'm already hinting at, is that of the British Planning Archive, which is stored at the Jerusalem Municipality Historical Archives. And these are just a few of the registries of the plans. Let me tell you a little bit about the planning of Jerusalem over 30 years. Excuse me. Starting close to home, the first collection which stood at the center of our endeavor was the British Planning Collection. In 30 years of British rule, 5 plans were made for the city, generally reflecting planning in Britain and its imperial sentiments. The official collection of the work of the Jerusalem Town Planning Committee was kept at the Jerusalem Municipality, and the Historical Archive now holds the records of some 1,000 British planning schemes, approved plans, hundreds of maps, and thousands of sheets of minutes of the planning committees across the whole period. These plans set the direction of Jerusalem growth until this very day, introducing foreign planning paradigms as well as concepts of hygiene, parcellation, zoning, all adapted locally according to the British perception of Jerusalem, as we mentioned, as a holy city. These plans set the skeleton for many of the new neighborhoods of the growing city. They introduced a ring road system around the old city and set guidelines and regulations for building heights, building rights, building density, and building material. And here are some of those plans. This is the key plan for the first 27 plans that were made for Jerusalem overall. So in 1918, the first thing that the British did was set the boundary of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was composed of an old city, a new city, and surrounded with local, mainly Arab villages. So in 1918, the first thing the British did was set the boundaries, as we call in planning, the blue line, the line which defines the area that should be planned. And this area was first divided into 27 regions, and the very important plans are plans for 27 different regions within the city, and these are some of them. After 1948 and the end of the British Mandate, British planning served for the development of both parts of the city, East Jerusalem, which became Jordanian for 19 years, and of course Western Jerusalem, while each part of the city developed separately for 19 years. After 1967, the Israeli planners found they relate to the original sentiments set by the British and were quick to follow many of the principles. If you remember, I started with the Holy City as a separate entity and its enclosure and its separation from the new city. If you know Jerusalem geography today, you know that these sentiments were well picked up by the Israeli planners. So with all British sentiments relating to the planning of conservation were somewhat debated under Israeli system, they are generally followed and present in the present and future planning of the city. The exposition and exploration of this collection suited our expectations regarding the modern development of the city. It was the next collection which surprised us. And the next collection, which I also already hinted at, is the Ottoman archives of Prime Minister, which are stored in Istanbul. To complement our research and exposition of the official physical development of Jerusalem from the middle of the 19th century onwards, from the outset of the project, we coordinated our research with a team of researchers at an Istanbul University, Kadir Has, headed by Professor Yonca Erkan, who is an architect and holds the UNESCO chair on management and promotion of World Heritage Sites. Professor Erkan's team was hired to identify and locate a selection of visual images and documents on the urban development of Jerusalem stored in the Ottoman archives. All these documents are written in Ottoman Arabic. They are not legible to those who do not read Ottoman Arabic, especially not to us researchers in Israel. So they were hired both to identify that collection and translate them for us, which is another great issue of cataloging and digitization. So the collection, which is written in Ottoman Turkish, I'm sorry, that's the correct term. The collection itself was actually recently scanned and it's available online. So they compiled a small collection for us and they concentrated on urban renewal and development. The findings of this research resulted in an exhibition which took place in Istanbul in November 2019, and these are some of the images of the actual exhibition. The exhibition was called His Merciful Majesty, an architectural glance at Jerusalem in light of Ottoman documents. As Professor Erkan explained, following the proclamation of the Tanzimat Edict in 1839, changes in the reorganization of the military, administrative, legal, educational systems, as well as social life transformed the face of Jerusalem. The process of urban development in the city, which came to life as part of the delicate balance between state intervention and local demands, was reflected in the correspondence between the central authority and the local government. So the exhibition, and I quote, opens doors to the process of modernization as it is expressed in the Ottoman archival documents, Al-Qudus al-Sharif. Archival visual materials such as architectural projects, maps, drawings, and photographs, as well as official documents, not only help generate a comprehensive understanding of the process, but simultaneously shed light on the architectural dimension of Ottoman modernization as well. So here we have the same use of the same terms, which were originally reserved to the British and the Zionists. All of a sudden, we get this fresh reading of Ottoman Jerusalem as a project of modernization. The same material arrived in Jerusalem, and it formed the basis for another exhibition, which we compiled ourselves here in Jerusalem, and it was displayed here in January 2022. It was COVID time, it was Omicron time. It was a beautiful exhibition. Hopefully it will all be available online because everyone was home in January. But as you can see, the opening was a great success. And it also surprised us the way that it was viewed and accepted by the local public. So our exhibition was called Qudus al-Sharif, a view at Jerusalem from Istanbul, changing the perspective. The pioneering juxtaposition of Ottoman documentation pertaining to the development of Jerusalem at the end of the Ottoman era, together with the early plans for Jerusalem made by mandate planners, was a chance to examine for the first time the differences between the two planning regimes, their motivations, their conduct, and their goals, and ask for the first time how the innovative yet Western imported discipline of town planning responded to the local land regime and its many components, how it adopted its imported regime to the local circumstances, and asked, did it pose only a break from eventual local Ottoman views, or were there also some continuities in the shaping of Jerusalem? It was also a chance to examine what we called public participation or crowdsourcing regarding our findings, as we encourage the visitors to the local exhibition, including researchers, students, local tour guides, and the general public, to share with us their own knowledge regarding the retrieved documents. We were surprised to receive corrections to the original document, which sent us looking for the mistakes. Were the mistakes made in the translation from the original Ottoman Turkish to English, or from English to Hebrew, or maybe from Hebrew to Arabic, or was it an original mistake made 100 years ago when the original document was written? And we also received many documentation regarding the actual sites and specific knowledge about unknown corners of the city, and a lot of suggestions for personal relevant collections. So these are the Ottoman collections, and I will point and I'll describe one or two more. So another collection, which is a little bit different, it's a private collection by an engineer called Ben-Zion Gini, which provided us both a more personal view at the shift from the Ottoman to the British, and a closer look at the actual practicalities of the shift. Ben-Zion Gini is known mainly as the Jewish municipal engineer of Jaffa in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, but he was also the municipal engineer of Jerusalem during the time of the transition from the Ottoman to the British Empire. His collection, as you can see, was stored in the private family home. His grandson is actually a known, he broadcasts on Israeli radio, so he's a known figure, but the archives are not known. Ben-Zion Gini was born in 1869 in Izmir, Turkey. He moved to Ottoman Palestine in 1883. He studied mechanical engineering in Paris on behalf of the Alliance School in Jerusalem. Then he returned to Jerusalem and taught at the school. And in the following years, he completed his engineering studies in Paris and in London. In 1911, he settled in Palestine and was immediately appointed city engineer of Jaffa. In 1917, he was invited by the Ottoman mayor of Jerusalem, Hussein Salim al-Husseini, to serve as Jerusalem's first city engineer. At that time, he also designed the Gaza City Hall and the renovation of the Cave of the Patriarchs in Hebron. After Palestine was occupied by the British, he continued in this position under the Mandate regime as the first British municipal engineer in Jerusalem. He worked on planning neighborhoods, main roads in the downtown area, planning infrastructure, and parceling in various neighborhoods, and in architectural planning of the building. So he did a lot in Jerusalem, but hardly anything is left of the documentation of his work. So this was a great treasure for us. Gini is well known to those who examined the modernization and development of Jaffa during this time, but in Jerusalem, he's much less known. One document which we found in the Jerusalem Historical Archives attests to the importance of his work. This is actually a base map prepared by Gini in March 1921, so during the British time, of the existing built landscape on Jerusalem. This was actually a prerequisite of the British planners who were working in Jerusalem at the time. Remember McLean, Ashby, and Geddes. They needed a background for modern planning. So the background for the British modern planning was made by the local municipal engineer, who was first Ottoman, now British, same city, same municipal engineer, completely different design attributes. But then again, on top of the map, and maybe you can see a little bit of it, Gini drew in red lines suggested additional roads, many of which preceded the eventual planning. This document, as well as the overall corpus of work created by Gini, brings to light additional questions regarding continuity rather than rupture in the modern planning of Jerusalem. I hope you're still with me. There's one more collection which I want to tell you about, and it's a completely different one, but it brings to light a lot of the complexities which I pointed to. So finally, we turn to a more processed kind of collection, one which makes some use of primary material described above, the Jerusalem Municipality Conservation File. There are about 4,000 sites which are listed in Jerusalem's list of conservation. It was compiled for the first time in 1964. Not all the sites are protected by law, because the Israeli law of antiquity only relates to buildings and sites established before 1700. Before 1700, all the buildings in Jerusalem were built within the old city. So everything that is built outside in the city, outside the city walls, is not protected by law. It is still listed. So the list contains many of the buildings of the garden suburbs established in Jerusalem in the 1920s and 30s, such as Rechavia and Tel Aviv. It also relates to buildings of earlier periods, still outside the city walls, as we call Hayetziah me'achomot, leaving the walls. Out of the 4,000 buildings, some 500 of them, which are generally located in what we call the inner city of Jerusalem of the Mandate period. So about 500 sites were researched and documented, producing documentation files. Remember, I told you that in order to preserve a building, first we have to document them. So out of the 4,000, about 500 of them were documented. But I have something to say about this documentation, obviously. These files are prepared mainly upon a building initiative which threatened the buildings. They include an architectural background of the building and its building context of varying depths. These files, prepared by architects and planners, are widely based on existing literature, which describe the modernization of Jerusalem and its development as a phenomena resting on British modern planning on one hand, and the Judaization of Jerusalem through Zionist initiatives on the other. They relate mainly to those of the Jewish neighborhoods, weaving them into a narrative of Jewish Zionist progress, which was conducted in spite of the restrictive, backward, and hostile Ottoman rule. The documents, including in the file, including city maps and historical background, tend to repeat themselves because we planners tend to make shortcuts and use the same documents that were already used by our colleagues. Make sense? Over the years, a basic corpus of documents is amalgamated, enhancing and perpetuating the same narrative of a joint British and Zionist narrative, excluding other contributions to the city development and leaving the Ottoman period as background, which is described in the better cases as not posing too many obstacles to the city's motivated buildings. So I will conclude by highlighting once again the importance of bringing together documents of different periods and making them available to people either by exhibitions or by making them known, and of course by digitizing them and making them available online. The digitization and exposition of documents of various collections pertaining to the city's modern development, including the Ottoman archives in Istanbul, collections of the historic archives of Jerusalem municipality, and private collections of past officials, create a unique platform from which to study anew the modern history of the city, responding to current research agendas of global transformation and local historiography, from the Ottoman era to the British Mandate, and aid in the integration of the research of the modern development and intentional planning of Jerusalem within the shifting temporal frameworks. The identification of collections of various sources, which were created by different governments and individuals, and which reflect changing political, disciplinary, and cultural agenda, their cataloging, their scanning, and eventually their juxtaposition create an extensive set of data, which, when examined as one corpus, allows for revelations, sometimes surprising, of connections, contributions, and continuities, which otherwise may be missed or dismissed altogether. Jerusalem archives and similar endeavors allow to tell anew the story of the building and the rebuilding of Jerusalem in the modern era.
So
thank you.
Thank you, Professor Rubin. Thank you everyone for attending. Please continue to send in your questions and I will try and get to as many as possible. So first question, which I think you actually touched upon in your concluding comments, is, you know, this push for continuity, right? And the question is, how might this more complicated vision of urban planning reshape our understanding of this era, right? Of this, and yield a fuller sense of these post-Ottoman continuities, right? I'm wondering if you could give really specific examples, right, of how you see these Ottoman continuities and the work that you are doing.
So the more conceptual answer is the actual shaping and development of a city. Eventually, we're talking about the same city and the same society, which continued to exist when the Ottomans left and when the British arrived. We tend to speak of them as two completely different sets of lifestyles, of regimes, but the city is the same city, and its development is the same. The building of the garden suburbs started before First World War. We know that plans for Talpiot were made beforehand. They were just eventually they just manifested. They managed to raise the money and do the actual building after the First World War. But they started at the Ottoman period. They just happened to be built during the British Mandate. So it's basically the same motivation of the same people, the same society, the same communities living in Jerusalem, which took over from the Ottomans into the Mandate. And we can see that that's one kind of continuity, the people, that we tend to overlook local micro history of the actual community, of the actual people. But that's one kind of continuity. The communities continued doing what they did even when the regime changed. Another continuity we can see is the strand of modernization. Modernization started at the end of the 19th century and carried on. It just took a different shape. Ottomans described or identified modernization as one thing. The British identified modernization as another. Of course, Jerusalem had its own unique stand in the British perception, but they both spoke about modernization. They did different things in order to modernize the city. Well, we can see that both tried to modernize and advance the city and to provide urban amenities to the local populations. So that's another strand, another conceptual continuity. And of course, the smaller examples are the municipality. The same municipality served the Ottomans and the British in almost the same location because the geography was continued. It was important for the Ottomans, and then eventually the same location was important for the British. So a lot of these things, and I just started with one example, the one of opening the new gates, but we can see a lot of accumulating examples of things that were continued rather than corrupted or abrupted with this change.
Thank you.
Infrastructure is one more example, which I didn't talk at all about.
Ooh.
The train, the roads. It wasn't an abrupt change.
Mhm.
It continued.
Thank you. We got a question about the relationship between planning and reality, right? As a scholar, right, to what extent, right, and a planner, right? My sister is an urban planner, so I have stories from her as well, right? To what extent were these plans accomplished, right? You have that picture of the sort of reality of what the old city looked like in the British version, right?
Yeah.
How did they change the landscape? To what effect did they did? Was it effective, right? And how can we look at these sort of two sets of realities as a scholar?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I will separate it into two. I will make the distinction. Regarding the Ottoman planning, I'm still studying them. This is the first time that I am viewing these documents and the first time they were made available to us in a language that I can read. So I'm still tracing what the Ottomans planned and what eventually came out. In fact, we have to look at it backwards. I know what the city looked like in 1918. I don't know how it's a result of earlier planning. That's something that I'm looking at thanks to this project. About the British, it's more complex. The British had a very, very clear notion of what they wanted the city to look like. They didn't manage, of course, all they wanted to do because it was a matter of time and capacity and energy and money, and the British didn't want to spend too much money here. So I'll just illustrate one example. One of the things that they wanted to do was physically separate the old city from the new. They wanted to take away all the buildings, all the encroachments, as they call them, that were built outside of the city walls. This was a very traditional way of expanding, of building a city, to build next to the farthest wall. This was the way the city was built in Ottoman times. When the British arrived, the first thing that they did was draw these beautiful photographs and plans of how these areas should be left open Of course, they couldn't manage it. They couldn't do it during their 30 years here. They managed a lot. They didn't do that because they didn't have the money or the capacity to take people out of their homes and tear them down in order to make this free esplanade, this free space to separate the new city from the old. Just to hint, that's exactly what they did in India and the many cities that they planned there. Jerusalem was completely different, but the notion was very, very similar. And I hope I'm not confusing you here, but there are lots of similarities of other colonial cities throughout the British Empire. Now, the interesting thing is, and I hinted to that, I didn't want to expand on it because it's a completely different story. In 1967, when we became the authority of planning Jerusalem, we took out those plans and we realized that the planners say it. The planners actually put it down in writing, in the actual plans. We were surprised to discover that we want exactly what the British wanted. And now, since we are the landlords and we can do whatever we want, that's exactly what we did. And if you know Jerusalem, then you know the beautiful park which surrounds the old city. It's a national park. It was actually declared just after the 6-Day War, a national park surrounding the old city. That's what it's called, the City Walls National Park. It was executed after 1967, but it follows the original Charles Robert Ashby plans from 1918, 1919. And the similarity is not a coincidence.
Thank
There
you.
are lots of other examples.
Of course.
Yeah.
I'm glad you mentioned other colonial cities, right? Because that was actually on
Yeah.
something on a list that I wanted to mention. We've mentioned this question sort of on the side, but I wanted to ask you about Palestinian documents, Palestinian narratives, right? To what extent is there Palestinian urban planning going on during the mandate period? Are there points of conversion and intersection with Zionist urban planning, maybe through the mandate or other things? And sort of relatedly, how does the archive think about Palestinian collections, right? Something that a lot of Palestinian scholars like Rashid Khalidi and whatnot have spoken about, how the role of archives in Palestinian memory.
Right, that's a big question. It's actually
two big questions.
Yeah. So the first question is the actual Palestinian planning. That's a fascinating topic, and that's another thing that I'm dealing with. Palestinian planning, Palestinian cities during the British Mandate. That's a fascinating topic. It's really under-researched. We have a lot of knowledge about British plans made for Palestinian or mixed cities. We have knowledge about Jewish planners and architects planning for Palestinian or mixed cities, such as the case of Lod, which was planned by a Jewish German newcomer in the 1930s. We know a lot less about Palestinian plans, and that's a topic that's now coming to life. We know of a beautiful plan for Jaffa, made actually by an Egyptian engineer who was brought to Jaffa by the Jaffa, obviously Palestinian mayor, and he drew a beautiful plan for Jaffa, which wasn't carried out, unfortunately, because it is a beautiful plan. So that's a very, very hot topic today in Israel. How can we combine, how can we enhance the story and not tell only about British plans or Jewish plans? We know a lot about Jewish plans. I wrote a little bit about Netanya. It's a small city, great story about how we planned the city for ourselves back in 1927. Great story. But what did the Palestinians do? It's a great question. And the other part of your question about the actual archives, that's a very big question. We tend to say that the Palestinian archives were burned down, just like what happened to Ben Zion Gini. That's why we can't find his professional archive. It was burned down. I suppose many of them, were destroyed during one war or another. But the truth is that we have very, very few Palestinian documentation in archives, and some people are now trying to uncover these, and hopefully someone out there is doing a similar project to ours with Palestinian documentation. In one way we can join metadata and uncover more correlation. But yeah, it's a big question. Thank you for that.
Right. And I know Salim Tamari from a different discipline, more from sort of historical sociology, of course, has done work on
Yeah.
this as well for those of you interested.
Right.
We got a question about the Jordanian occupation. Do you have any documents from Jordanian officials during their rule? What has the effect of the Jordanian occupation been on Jerusalem, right? If you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah. So I'll talk a little bit about that. First of all, it's an excellent question about archives. What happened to the Jordanian archives? They ruled over Jerusalem for 19 years. Obviously, they worked in the city, they documented themselves, they made plans, they had protocols, they had meetings. What happened to those papers? That's a beautiful question. And parts of those collections keep turning up. And then, you know, it's like a detective story. How did this collection arrive in this place? A few years ago, a beautiful collection of the Jordanian documentation of ruling the city, of the municipality of Jordan over the city, turned up in Truman Institute at the Hebrew University. How did it arrive there? So, you know, one of the students took it upon himself to discover, and he realized that there is an Israeli soldier working in East Jerusalem after 1967, and he found these boxes, and he said, oh, you know, my university is a great place to keep the boxes. You know, I might not telling the story very, very exactly, but this is the way things happen. So boxes are scattered around. So one of the reasons that we're working in this archive in this project with different archives is that we want to bring them together. Another part of that collection is stored in the historical archives of the Jerusalem municipality. But we already mentioned the problematics of working there, and they don't know what to do with those boxes. They just don't know how to handle them. They don't know how to catalog them. They don't know how to keep them. They won't translate them. So it's a missing link in the planning of Jerusalem. And I have at least 2 colleagues who are working today on the planning of Jordanian Jerusalem, and hopefully, you know, they will tell new stories. I will tell you of one thing that I know, that the planner who was working in Jerusalem, the British planner who was working in Jerusalem until 1948, became the planner of Eastern Jerusalem during Jordanian time. His name was Henry Kendall, and he produced a beautiful plan for East Jerusalem in 1964. And in 1967, where the 2 parts of the city were brought together, the Israeli planners tried to accommodate Kendall's plan into the plan of the new renewed city. But it had a completely different agenda. So eventually it didn't work out. But there is a completely different set of planning, which is, missing from the story. You're right.
Right. And I think it's important to, you know, you said this already, but I think it's important to emphasize, right? This project is in addition to, alongside, right, the municipal archive that does exist, that's run by the city, by the municipality, but is in a complicated state. And we'll say that can be a whole nother discussion. So it's also just a very interesting question of different archives and who runs them and all sorts of things. We got a lot of questions about digitization, right? As I'm sure all of you know, digitization, and as you mentioned, this is not a neutral process, right? There are a lot of things that come up. So I'm gonna, I'll ask a couple of questions and you can decide that are the same similar vein. You can decide sort of how to think about them. One is the idea of sort of, how to say this, simultaneousness, simultaneity, right? Right, when you can look at things on a screen, you can put things together in different ways that they wouldn't have so far or wouldn't have done. You have to, you know, say, go from one archive to the other. So how does that change things? We also got a question about digital formats, right? I don't know to what extent your archive deals with, let's say, the modern era, but you know, is your ideal that people are printing out emails and sending them to you, right? How do you think of like digital communication and changes in digital formats for your archive? And then one more of this sort of is what's lost when we digitize, right? When we create this digital archive, which even if we think it is a greater good, I definitely do, there are things that are lost. Or what are the things that we think about with that? So that's all a lot, but they're all the sort of similar vein. So I wanted to group them together.
Yeah, great question. So I'll try to respond to all of them. So first of all, it really isn't neutral. And we ourselves make interpretation when we choose the documents that we want to digitize. Our funds are not limitless, and we have to choose the boxes from which we want to scan papers. And we sometimes even go into different files and choose the papers that we want to scan because we decide they're more important. Why is our interpretation more important than someone else who will come tomorrow and will say, I want to view different documents? So there's always a process of selection, even in this allegedly neutral process of digitization, and it must be, put forth. When we started the project and asked the Ottoman team to make a selection for us, we didn't realize that we were actually appointing them to make this biased selection of documentation. Now, I can't go back to the Ottoman archives and choose my own because I don't speak the language. So I have to rely on their interpretation of the quest that I put forth to them. So that's about the neutrality. The format is a big issue, and I hope I'm responding to what you were asking. We wanted at first we wanted to do real crowdsourcing, and we really wanted people to send us emails and to share with us their own documentation and to even be able to upload to our site their own documentation and tell their own stories. And very quickly we realized that we cannot do that. We don't have the capacity of being, and it's an unfortunate term, but we have to be gatekeepers of our site. If we want to keep the site orderly, and if we want to keep some kind of unification of our material, and if we want to have some kind of integrity and authorship of the papers that we put forth, we have to go over the papers ourselves. Now, unfortunately, this project is not funded to run forever, so we weren't able to produce this ongoing process of allowing people to bring their own. So that's one of the things that we did in the exhibition. That was one of the chances that we had of having direct connection with people and allowing them to bring us their sources. But it's not simple at all. I think there was another question which I missed, maybe about the formats.
Right. Looking at different archives together, like bringing together different sources that wouldn't have necessarily been brought together before.
Yes. So I'll tell you a little story about, what we're doing today. We're working on the design of our website. And we asked ourselves, what happened if someone writes not Ben Zion Gini and not Shar Zion? He writes Zion. The search term is Zion. What kind of result will he get? What will the list be composed of? And we kept thinking of unexpected results. I mean, it doesn't go the way that we expect things to go. I want people to go and write Ben Zion Gini, and then I will produce the beautiful collection which I found and scanned. Or I want them to write Shar Zion, and then I can show them all the documents that I found in the Ottoman archives. But that's not the way that things work. There will be surprising searches, and there will be surprising results. And the list will actually compose a completely different narrative. It will be the researcher's goal, the researcher's aim, to make sense of the documentation which he retrieves. But let's go for the simpler option. He goes for Ben Zion Gini. The results will include Ben Zion Gini's personal files. It will include Ben Zion Gini bus tickets, which were included in his personal archives. It will include correspondence. It will include a preservation file where Ben Zion Gini is mentioned. It will include a British mandate documentation from the municipality where he was working, and it might even include a documentation from the Ottoman period from Jaffa, because it was kept in his files. So the actual result will lend itself to the personal interpretation of the researcher, and I will be as surprised as anyone else to see what will come up. So I think the actual juxtaposition of different documents from completely different sets of archives, that will be the great surprise. And I think that's the great potential of the project.
Reminds me, think about the usability of the archive. I was in the Tel Aviv archive once, and a family came in to try and look for information on a building that they thought a relative might have owned, and they said his name was Eli Cohen and he lived in Tel Aviv in the 50s, and the archivist laughed them out. She was like, I'll be here all day, I can't search that. which is just a very interesting experience. I don't know what happened after that. That's all I overheard, but sort of how we think about the archive and its use for us.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask how, this project, are there other things going on like this on the municipal level in Israel, in terms of digitization of municipal history? Where are they going on, and also in the region as well? What are some of the other projects that you've either been in touch with or know about that have similar approaches?
Yes, there are a lot of projects of digitization. They are of different scales and of different goals. And the National Library is actually combining many of them together. There are lots of projects going on in the National Library which try to bring together the different projects in order to make them visible, to make them known to the public. So one of my favorites is the Haifa University, the Technion, actually, it's not the Haifa University, the Technion, have their own architectural archive of planners and architects in Palestine from the beginning of the 20th century. And they have a completely different set of findings than we do. And it's very interesting to go and combine and to compare our collections to them. And the findings are amazing because we each have our own set of goals. But when we put our findings together, we discover completely different stories. Another archive, which I have a personal connection to, is also in the National Library. It's named after my supervisor at the Department of Geography. He was a Jerusalem lover, and he collected a lot of material about Jerusalem as an archaeologist, as a geographer, as a historian. And when he passed away, he left a whole room of documentation of Jerusalem. So now the National Library is actually putting up a collection in his name of his papers. A lot of them have to do with my work. I was a student, but there is a lot more material that I have no access to and no interest in because it was archaeology. It has nothing to do with what I do. But he also worked in close conjunction with the Antiquities Authority. So this project is bringing together his papers, it's a personal collection with similar collections in the Antiquities Authority. And they call it Jerusalem Archives because it's all about Jerusalem. And it's a completely different set of collections than the ones that I'm going to make available online. So yes, there are lots of different endeavors. And I think that, the government office, which supports many of these projects, is called the Office of the Ministry of Jerusalem and Heritage. Why are they put together? I don't know. But we do have a Ministry of Jerusalem and Heritage, and this ministry is supporting many of these personal, private projects in the aim of making as many documents and as many collections available online. And then it's left for us, the researchers, to make the connection. So the potential of digitization is huge, and the more we digitize, the potential rises. And I think that this ministry realized that, and that's why they're supporting, for example, our project. And they say, it doesn't matter if you do 6 collections or 50. Eventually, they all sum up. And hopefully, our project will, we're working at allocating more funds, and hopefully we won't stop at 6 collections and rise to more. But the more collections we put up there, the more information and the greater story, the greater the story will get.
Wait, we're getting comments about interesting collections coming in. I just want to mention, I don't know about this, but someone mentioned that that the municipality in Yafa, Tel Aviv is creating what they call a new archive using GIS. And for those of you who don't know what GIS, who maybe don't have siblings who are urban planners, right? GIS is a mapping software where you can map different layers, right? So, here we're talking about digitization of documents, but the use of mapping software in creating a new sort of archive is also another huge, really interesting topic that obviously is hugely relevant for a place like Israel, Palestine, which has, dozens of different layers. I want to ask one final question, and that's sort of about Jerusalem today. Right? We spent a lot of time thinking about different paths of Jerusalem, different ideas of Jerusalem. How has this project changed how you thought about just sort of walking around Jerusalem, where you live?
Oh,
What
wow.
things have you noticed, right? You know, you have about 4 minutes.
Yeah.
So
Thank you. Wow.
yeah.
Great question to end with. I feel like the city is coming alive. I know it's very poetic, and I've lived in Jerusalem most of my life, and I know Jerusalem quite well. But having been exposed myself to these different layers of documentation, I feel like the city is coming alive, because all of a sudden, it's much clearer to me to see like archaeological layers of the building of the city. And I don't even talk about the old city. I mean, the old city, of course, is more than 3,000 years of layering, and the archaeology is endless. But even in the new city, 150 years of urban design and urban accumulation is a lot. And even in a specific building, you can think of all the people who live there. There's a beautiful project by one of my colleagues, Toby Fenster, about the archaeology of an address. And this is exactly what she's doing. Archaeology of an address. She's going from the very beginning of who built the building and who had lived in it for years, and how the ownership changed, and who are the people who are living there now. And it's another project of archival research, because just retrieving the documentation is once again a detective work. How do you find the documentation which tells the story of one building which was built 100 years ago? So for me, once, you know, I feel like I put on a very, very strong set of glasses. When I walk down the streets of Jerusalem now, I imagine so much more than what the eye can see, because I just imagine the documentation that went into the building of the city, and all the people who were involved, and the different regimes, and the different ideas, and the different disciplines that were involved in the building of each and every street. And basically, you know, I'm a lecturer, but I'm also a practitioner, and I want to make this information available. This is what we started with. I want to make this information available to as many practitioners as possible, so they will share with me this renewed perspective of the city, this new appreciation of its built environment.
So thank you so much. Thank you, Professor Rubin, for a really amazing talk about, with so many dimensions and so many interesting things. We really look forward to seeing the fruits of your labor and your team. I want to thank you all for coming today, everyone in our audience. I want to remind you that our next event in the seminar series will be called The Nun in the Synagogue, Judeo-Centric Catholicism in Israel, on October 27th. That will be a hybrid event, so either in person or on Zoom. And again, thank you all for coming. You can check out our social media and our website for learning more. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you. Shana Tova.
And Shana Tova.